Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. It is top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started so we don't run out of time. This is part one of a two-part series of webinars on Are You Ready for October 1, 2020, which is the liability shift date for outdoor EMV. Today is part one, and we're going to focus on the EMV fundamentals and the risk of not upgrading. Part two will be next Thursday at the same time, and if you haven't registered for that, I would encourage you to do so. So I want to go over our agenda. Next slide. So our agenda today, I'm going to go through some housekeeping items. I'm going to introduce our presenters. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Conexxus, and then we're going to get on to our main presentation. And we've saved some time for Q&A. Next slide. So the webinar is being recorded, and it'll be made available sometime in the next couple of weeks. All of our webinars are recorded, and you can find them on our YouTube channel. You can also link to them from our website. If you go out on conexxus.org and you go to resources, underneath that is webinars, and then you can sort by topic and date, and you can find lots of good information out there. After this presentation is completed, you'll get an automated email in a couple of hours. And if you fill out the survey, it's just a couple of questions. At the end, you'll have a link to the presentation deck. All of you are on mute, and the way you need to ask questions is on the webinar interface UI. There's a button called Questions. And you can go ahead and submit your questions through there. I would encourage you to submit your questions early as they come up. Don't wait until the very end. I suspect we will run out of time. Normally there's a lot of questions on EMV. So the earlier you get your questions in, the more likelihood they'll be answered. And if you have any questions after the fact, you can always email us at info@conexxus.org if we don't get to yours, and we can hook you up with the right people to get you an answer. So next slide. So my name is Linda Toth. I'm Director of Standards for Conexxus. I'm your host and moderator today. I have with me two subject matter experts on EMV. I'm really thrilled that both of them are with me today. The first is Robert Allant. He is Senior Director Merchant Solutions for Visa, and he's going to talk to us about fraud trends. And then I also have Brian Russell, who's the lead EMV business analyst for Verifone. And Brian knows all kinds of things about EMV. He's in charge of that over at Verifone, and he's one of the smartest guys I know in terms of EMV implementation, so I'm happy that he's with us to talk about the fundamentals and some implementations. So next slide. I did want to just talk a little bit about Conexxus. If you're not familiar with us, we are a nonprofit technology organization that's dedicated to the C-store and retail fuels industry. We're independent of NACS, or the National Association of Convenience Stores, but we partner very heavily with NACS, and we're their technology arm. Conexxus is a volunteer organization. Our members do the heavy lifting. People like Brian, who participate in a lot of our committees, work on the behalf of the industry. Conexxus just provides that neutral forum where retailers and vendors can network and come together to create standards and solutions to benefit our industry. We do standards for data exchange between devices in and around the forecourt and inside the store, connected devices outside the physical store environment, such as electronic business to business or forecourt device controller. We also do payment standards for our industry, and that would include things like mobile, EPS, loyalty, digital offers, and most recently EMV fleet tags. We also educate on a number of topics such as PCI requirements, skimming prevention, EMV, etc. We do this through white papers, which are available out on our website, as well as webinars like this one. We also advocate on behalf of the industry at organizations to make sure that we steer towards whatever is good for the industry. So if organizations are doing standards that could affect us, we're there at the table making sure that they understand our business realities, and just to make sure that policies or standards that are being set don't negatively impact the industry, and EMV is certainly no exception. Next slide. So we do webinars at least once a month. Sometimes we have more than one, including this month where we have a two-part EMV. If you don't already get the emails, you can drop us a line at webinars@conexxus.org, and you can get on our mailing list. And again, if you haven't registered for part 2, you want to do that. Gray's going to be moderating that along with somebody from Dover. He's got somebody from Gilbarco lined up and Invenco, so that should be a good one. Go ahead and next slide. I want to just also mention that our annual conference is coming up in April of next year. Registration for that will be open soon, so put that on your calendars. And I also wanted to give a big shout out to our 2019 annual Diamond sponsors. These folks provide extra money to the organization, and that allows us to fund any number of projects. So thank you, Diamond sponsors. Next slide. So EMV, that's our main topic today, so let's go ahead and get started. EMV stands for Europay, MasterCard, and Visa, and these were the original companies who created the EMV specifications. Today, that specification is maintained by EMVco, which is made up of the 4 U.S. card brands, MasterCard, Visa, Amex, and Discover, along with JCB and China Union Pay. And the thing that's unique about an EMV card is the chip. That's why oftentimes it's referred to as chip card. But that's a microprocessor with memory that's actually built into the card, and this allows data to be read out of and written back to the card, so it provides additional functionality. So that's where the name chip card comes from. And the next slide, the liability shift dates. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. October 1 of 2015 was the date when all of the liability happened except for our automated fuel dispensers. So inside the store, that's already taken effect in 2015. We did have a 3-year deferment. So our new date is 300 days from today, October 1, 2020. So next slide. So a lot of times people say, well, I don't really understand what liability shift means. Well, simply put, it shifts to the party in the payment chain with the least secure payment technology. And this can depend on any number of factors, including the fraud type, whether it's counterfeit or lost and stolen. It can depend on the card type, whether it's mag stripe only or chip. It can depend on the card brand, such as Visa or MasterCard. It can depend on the location, whether it's at your AFD or indoor. And it can also depend on the capabilities of the systems that you have installed in your site. But the bottom line is, if you're a retailer and you implement EMV, you are generally covered of any kind of fraud. Next slide. So we know that outdoor EMV, a lot of people aren't prepared, but we wanted to get a handle on where the industry stood. So Conexxus put together an EMV survey this past summer. We invited 1,100 plus unique merchants to participate. We ended up with 88 responses representing a little over 26,000 sites. And the survey covered any number of topics, including, indoor, outdoor, contactless, just fraud techniques in general. There's a lot of good information. If you're curious about some of the other data points, that survey is released. It's on our website, so you can go out and read all the details. But I just wanted to bring you a couple of data points just to set context. So let's talk about outdoor, and this was contact. 70% of our respondents had no sites deployed. 80% planned to deploy it, but 17% were undecided. When it comes to whether or not they're going to be ready by our shift date, 42% expect to be ready, leaving 58% not. Of those that were undecided, we asked why, and they could choose more than one reason, but the top ones were the cost of upgrades and not understanding the risk versus the expense. So when it comes to fraud, there are 2 types of fraud out there. The first is lost and stolen. This is exactly what it sounds like. It means that you are no longer in possession of your card. Your wallet was stolen, you lost your purse, you forgot to take your card back when you used it for a payment. Basically, somebody else physically has your card, you no longer have it. This makes up roughly 10% of the fraud, so a very minor percentage. The thing that makes up the most is counterfeit, and counterfeit is where somebody has compromised your account information. So you still have your card in your wallet, but somebody else has created a fake card with your credentials. or they're using it in a card not present environment. So this makes up 90% of the fraud out there. So that's what we're most concerned about. So, you know, you might be thinking, well, I don't have fraud at my site. I really don't even see skimming. You know, this doesn't affect me. But in fact, there's a lot of fraud out there, and we wanted to understand as an industry what we were going to be facing. So Conexxus asked the 4 major U.S. card brands, American Express, Discover, Visa, and MasterCard, to provide counterfeit fraud data for the AFDs. 3 of the card brands provided us with data for 2018 and the first quarter of 2019, and a couple did it for Q2 of 2019. We were able to project out the market share for the 4th brand. So total, we were looking at $299 million in counterfeit AFD fraud in 2018. When you look at the trend upward, it is increasing at an average of 23% year over year. So simple calculation, in 2019, we're going to be facing $367 million. And in 2020, we're looking at $451 million in fraud. So that pool of fraud, $451 million, is what you're going to be sharing if you're not EMV enabled. And the thing to remember is that the fraudsters aren't going to wake up 300 days from now on October 1, 2020 and decide to change jobs. They're going to seek out sites that are not EMV enabled to continue what they've been doing today. So it's important to understand that if you're not EMV enabled, you're going to be sharing in this $451 million fraud pool. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Robert, and he's going to talk to us about fraud trends as seen by Visa.
Thanks, Linda. Hi, everyone. My name is Robert Allant. I work here at Visa in our Merchant Solutions group, and for about the last 8 years, I've been focused on helping U.S. fuel merchants optimize their Visa acceptance. What I wanted to do today was to give you an idea of what we're seeing at Visa as far as fraud and chargeback trends, talk a little bit about the rules and some other things. So let's start off talking a little bit about fuel transactions for inside. Fuel merchants are a little bit unique in that you guys, for the most part, have been through this experience of upgrading your point of sale terminals to chip already for your inside transactions. And so what I thought I might do is to start talking a little bit about what we're seeing as far as that, and then talk a little bit about what's happening out at the pumps. But today, you can see the trend on this slide from January 2016. This is through August of 2019. And this is the trend of authorizations for inside transactions coming from a terminal that indicates that it's chip enabled. And we're right now at about 90% of all inside authorizations originating from a terminal that is chip enabled, and you can see the trend there as it's gone up. We can go to the next slide. And correspondingly, on this chart, we can see that the change in trends for reported fraud and for fraud chargebacks. So let me take you through this slide a little bit. The top orange bar that you see there represents what issuers are reporting to Visa as counterfeit fraud, and the yellow line below that, or the gold line below that, is actually what they were charging back. This is the rate of fraud, or the rate of counterfeit fraud chargebacks to their sales. And so you can see here that in both trends on counterfeit, the trend has been down, really inverse of seeing that the terminals have become chip enabled. So, you know, this is not theoretical. We know that it works, and you can see here the benefits of all the work that you have all put into enabling inside terminals to become chip enabled, and the corresponding reduction in counterfeit fraud. The two blue lines there, the light blue is the rate of lost stolen fraud that issuers are reporting, and the dark blue is the chargebacks, the rate of lost stolen chargebacks. And you can see here, as time has gone on, the gap's gotten a little wider between the two. There's a little more white space as we get into 2018, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that as merchants have enabled chip inside, they've turned off key entry, so they only fall back to magstripe. And at least with the Visa rules, as long as the transaction is electronically read, then the issuers cannot charge back for lost, stolen, fraud on an inside transaction. So that's something to be mindful of once you've enabled chip inside, is to only fall back to magstripe and not to counterfeit. Okay, if we go to the next slide. So now here's the trend, same idea of what we just saw for inside, but here's what's happening outside at the pumps. And you can see that kind of just following up on some of the things that Linda said, we're seeing counterfeit fraud just continuing to increase outside. That orange line month after month is continuing to trend up. The gold line at the very bottom is counterfeit fraud chargebacks at the pump. And under Visa rules, the only chargebacks that a U.S. merchant could receive would be for a cross-border transaction. Most likely, if the merchant prompts for AVS at the pump, those would be Canadian issued cards. The two blue lines again represent the rate of lost, stolen fraud. The light blue, what issuers are reporting, and the dark blue is what they're charging back. And again, just kind of following up on what Linda was saying, it's much less than counterfeit, and we're really not seeing any change, any discernible change in lost, stolen fraud at the pump. Again, it's all related to counterfeit, and chip authenticates the card, and that's what will address that fraud. So if we go to the next slide. Here are the top 10 states for counterfeit in the US. This is through the second quarter of 2019 through June, the annual amount of counterfeit fraud. And you can see here that the state of Florida accounts for the most counterfeit fraud in the country. Texas is now number 2. It recently surpassed California, which is now number 3. And you can see how some of the remaining states are there. I will say that as bad as Florida is, it has come down from previous years, but we have seen fraud push out into other states. And so some states have appeared in the top 10 over this period that weren't there the year prior. So, you know, one of the points I want to make here is that your state may not have a lot of counterfeit fraud right now, or you may not see a certain amount of counterfeit fraud, but the crooks are always moving and shifting and finding that weakness. And so it's really just a matter of time before they focus in on you. The other thing that point I want to make here is that you know, right now you may not have a lot of counterfeit fraud and may not want to feel that you need to do an upgrade. But at some point, as I said, they may find you, and then at that point, you're not only dealing with counterfeit fraud chargebacks coming in if it's after October, but also you're dealing with the cost of upgrades. We can go to the next slide, please. I just want to give everyone an idea as to where we are on chip issuance. Visa cards having chips on them here in the U.S. market. As of September of this year, 99% of our payment volume was on a card that had a chip on it, whether it was chip read or magstripe read. So 99% of, again, transactions occurred on a card that had a chip. 99.8 of those were on credit cards. 98% was on debit. So debit is a little bit behind, but as you can see, we're pretty much closing in on 100% of all Visa cards that are walking around out there on the street having a chip on them. So again, going through all this expense of implementing EMV, you're going to see cards that are going to be EMV enabled to be able to transact that way. Right now, about 2/3 of all of our credit transactions are chip on chip, and about 62% of all debit is now chip on chip. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. So I just wanted to kind of review the liability shift. Linda talked about it a little bit earlier. So this slide kind of gives you an idea as to how the liability shift works relative to the card, the capability of the terminal, if it's enabled or not, and then who has the liability. So the way the liability shift works for Visa and the other brands are very similar. is if the card has a chip on it, but the terminal is only enabled to read the mag stripe and not the chip, then that liability for counterfeit fraud will shift to the acquirer and merchant. As of the dates here, we had the point of sale liability shift back in 2015, so that would be your inside transactions. I mentioned that cross-border AFD went in 2017, and then, as Linda has said, we're coming up very quickly on the October 2020 date, where U.S. domestic AFD transactions will be impacted by this shift. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. The other point I want to make here that has to do with lost stolen fraud at the pump. And again, I'm kind of more speaking to Visa transactions here, but currently, if a transaction is mag stripe read, as a merchant, you retain liability for lost stolen fraud, which is one of the reasons many of you prompt for AVS to try to authenticate the cardholder to mitigate that fraud. As of 2014, we put a rule in place that said that if a transaction was done as a chip-on-chip transaction, whether that's contact chip or whether that's the contactless version of chip, which we call QVSDC, that liability for lost stolen fraud actually shifts to the issuer, and there's no PIN involved here. So once a pump is upgraded to EMV, if all transactions are chip-on-chip, that lost stolen fraud goes to the issuer. If the pump's upgraded to EMV and the transaction falls back to a mag stripe read, then the liability will still rest with the merchant and the acquirer. So one thing as a merchant you may want to consider when you implement EMV at the pumps is to only allow chip-on-chip transactions at the pump and send any fallback transactions inside the store for completion, similar to what you would do if you're prompting for AVS and you get a no match response on that. Okay, we can go to the next slide. I want to make sure that you're all aware that we have a best practices guide that is available to U.S. petroleum merchants and acquirers. It's out on publicly available on our visa.com website at the URL you see here, or you can just Google the name of this publication. We just updated it in June of this year. It has a lot of information in there about just general fuel processing, but we put a lot in there about EMV. There's a section in there on EMV, and it's everything from how the transactions work to how to handle PIN prompting for, let's say, contactless transactions, all that kind of information. So it's a great training tool for folks, but it's a great reference guide as well to go back to if you need information to better understand how to go about enabling EMV and other things as it relates to fuel. Okay, next slide. That's all I have. My email address is there if you have any specific questions or anything that I can help you with. And I'll turn it over to Brian.
All right, thank you very much, Robert. My name is Brian Russell. I work as an EMV business analyst for Verifone, as Linda mentioned. So I've been in the trenches of EMV implementation since well before 2015. So Linda and Robert have talked about why you need to implement EMV, and I thought I'd chime in at the end here and kind of tell you exactly what it is and why it helps. Why are we doing this? So with that, I'm going to start off with what is it. Linda told you what EMV stands for. I always skip that part because that's all everybody always tells you, but I like to know what it actually does. So what EMV actually is a set of standards that defines how payment cards operate under the chip environment, and it reduces counterfeit fraud. They have that chip there, and the purpose of that chip, among other things, for fraud prevention purposes, is to perform cryptographic functions that make counterfeiting of that card practically impossible. In the last year, maybe 2 years, you started to see some contactless cards get issued. There's been well over 100 million cards, I think, issued in 2019 under the contactless interface. You can also use contactless EMV with your phone too. If you're using Apple Pay or Google Pay and you tap on an EMV-enabled terminal, you are going to do an EMV transaction over contactless. So that's what EMV is, what it does for us. I also like to point out what EMV is not, because this surprises people a lot of times. They hear EMV is for secure transactions, such and such, and assume that maybe the data is protected, but in fact it's not. EMV is not a data encryption standard. None of the data that's read from the chip is encrypted. Everything comes in the clear. So as we read the PAN and as we read the track data from that chip, it comes across to the reader, unless there's an, a point-to-point encryption in place or something other than EMV in place, comes across in the clear. So your card data must still be protected. There's still very valid reasons to do point-to-point or end-to-end encryptions to protect your data. Just realize that EMV is not providing data protection in terms of encryption or any other PCI type things like that. So important to understand that. So card fraud. As Linda mentioned, counterfeit fraud accounts for about 90% of all the fraud. Lost and stolen is about 10% of all the fraud. So where does EMV help in that case? Well, it just so happens that EMV fits nicely into those categories because it has the most protection for counterfeit fraud. That's its biggest impact for merchants. It works for contact and contactless. All EMV transactions are protect against counterfeit fraud, regardless of whether you run them contactless, whether you enter a PIN or not. All EMV transactions provide counterfeit fraud protection. Some EMV transactions can also prevent lost and stolen fraud. It depends on the cardholder verification method. So we refer to that in the industry as CVM. I had all these acronyms in here, and Linda kindly reminded me that a lot of people may not know what they are. But the cardholder verification methods are things like a PIN that you enter when you present your card, or if you're using your phone, it might be either the PIN or your fingerprint or facial recognition, something like that, that identifies you to that card as the card holder itself to prevent lost and stolen. EMV also supports that. In the US, for most of the global card brands, we don't see a lot of PIN prompts except for debit. But it is possible to do. So EMV provides both those fraud prevention methods. So how does it do this? Well, and understand I'm talking high level here in terms of how it does it. So I'm not going to get into the gory details, but there's a couple different ways that a card and a terminal and an issuer can look at the data that EMV provides to determine that the card is a genuine card. And the first happens locally at the terminal, between the terminal and the card. It's called offline data authentication. And all that is a cryptographic exchange of data between the chip and the card. The card has some keys on it. The terminal has some keys on it. And using those keys, the card and the chip generate a cryptographic signature that can be validated, that provides very good assurance that that card is a genuine card. That's not always performed, but it often is. It can be done whether the transaction is done in a stand-in, as a lot of original EMV transactions originally were when EMV first came out 20 odd years ago. We weren't always connected to a host, so if you were doing stand-in type transactions, this was a very good check to make sure that the card was genuine. What's used exclusively in the US or extensively in the US today is something that we call an online cryptogram. And that's the same type of signature. It's a signature created by the card. It is a signature of data that's found in the transaction that varies. So it uses dynamic data to create this signature. And that signature then is passed in the request that we send to our acquirer and off to the issuer, that the issuer can then validate that that cryptogram that was generated by the card was something that could have been generated by the keys, the keys that are on that card. And again, very, very good assurance that the card is a genuine card in that case. So both those methods can be used either independently or together. Both help assure that a genuine EMV card is in use for the transaction. So very strong prevention against counterfeit fraud. So EMV sounds great, and it is working great outdoors. As I was Googling around for information to put in this report, I ran across a Visa announcement that's just like less than a month old that indicated that 80% of fraud has been eliminated or reduced to, or fraud has been eliminated 80% at sites that have implemented EMV. So it's working really, really well. So, of course, let's take it to the AFDs, right? You saw the trend that Robert put up, that counterfeit fraud is increasing out there. But what's happened? Why has it taken us so long to do this? And I guess more importantly, you know, what are we doing about it? So I thought I'd go into those issues in the next couple slides. So in Petro, we have a number of challenges. Maybe chief among them is the diversity that's in the Petro market. You know, we have everything from the mom and pop single store that's on the corner to mega centers. There's places in Buc-ee's in Texas that have hundreds of pumps on their forecourt. So we span that range of pumps that sites that we support. So that's a challenge. The scale also is a challenge. You know, you might think, you think of the big box stores and the thousands of locations that they have around the country. Well, add all of them together and they pale but to the number of locations that Petro has. We have 124, roughly 124,000 fueling locations across the country, and just extrapolating out about the average number of pumps they have outside and the devices they have inside, we have about 1 million EMV terminals in play that we have to deal with, and they aren't all homogeneous either. They're you know, indoor they might be a couple of brands, outdoors there are a couple of different brands. So we have to deal with a lot of this stuff, mix match of multiple EMV kernels and devices. And in addition to that, along with you know, moving EMV outdoors, the capabilities or the features haven't stood still either. So since contact EMV first came on the scene in 2015, or most locations supported contact only, almost everybody's wanting to do contactless now too. So that kind of got wrapped up in the outdoor rollout, so it complicates things a little bit more. On top of that, our card readers that are outside interact a little differently than the card readers do inside. So there's things, without getting into a great deal of detail about how an EMV transaction works. Once an EMV transaction works, the payment application kind of loses control over that device. And those of you that have used outdoor payment terminals, and that's probably pretty much everybody at this point, you know that there are things that happen outside, like loyalty prompting, zip code prompting, that type of stuff that takes place. That's much more difficult to do when the EMV kernel is in charge of that device. So there's those things to overcome. Robert mentioned fallback processing outside. There's a couple of different fallback strategies that I know our customers, speaking from Verifone, have had. So we have to deal with different merchants, different customers wanting to handle fallback in different ways. The reader itself, if you think of how a pump works outside, it's the same reader that reads the chip as reads the mag stripe, versus the mag stripe reader at the pin pad terminal inside is completely separate from the chip reader of the of the cards. So handling that's a little bit differently. We have a lot of fleet processing that goes on in the petroleum environment. And it just so happens that right now we're in a transition stage for fleet. You know, we're starting to see some fleet cards with new EMV specifications coming online. So we're in the process of upgrading those things. As we've rolled out the second and third rounds of EMV, we've added additional AIDs. You know, the first EMV releases tended to be limited to like the big four. Well, we're adding, you know, maybe Interac, JCB, China Union Pay. I mentioned the fleets. There's a couple of new fleet AIDs coming out. There's some private label cards that have their own AIDs. So a lot of new payment AIDs coming out as well. The other thing from a merchant point of view is certainly the financial investment. You know, and this probably hurts smaller merchants especially hard. They don't have the resources that these large sites have, yet it still costs the same for them to upgrade their pumps. There's a shortage of technicians, and that's only going to get worse as we get closer and closer to the deadline. 300 days, I hadn't counted the days down before, but 300 days and counting. So as we get closer to that deadline, getting technicians to come out to install that hardware, which requires upgrades, and sometimes the software as well, is going to be a problem. Software availability has been a problem certainly in the past. I think that's starting to lessen a little bit, but even when the software is available, remember those 124,000 physical sites, you know, getting that software rolled to all those sites, often to places that don't have centralized you know, IT data distribution capability is a big challenge. And finally, one of the things that impacts your vendors, certainly Verifone, has had this impact us, especially difficult because we support so many different combinations of things. There's a large number of EMV certifications that go on, and I'm actually going to talk about that in detail a little bit later, just in a couple slides. So that was the doom and gloom part. So what are we doing to address these issues? Certainly technical solutions are always in play. Having smart guys do your work at your vendors, you know, all of you probably are doing that. But one of the things that's kind of unique in the petro industry is the industry collaboration that we have. Linda in her intro talked a lot about Conexxus in terms of what they do for the industry. You know, they set standards, they provide education, they advocate for the industry. They also work with the U.S. payment forum. They work with individual vendors like Verifone. We certainly have a lot of interaction with Conexxus, with NACS. They represent the merchants' needs in the industry. So big supporter there. The U.S. payment forum, if you're a larger merchant or an acquirer or a vendor, you probably have heard of the U.S. payment forum. If you're a smaller merchant, you may not have heard of this organization, but that's an organization where the card brands participate and everybody talks about their experiences, recommendations, best practices, that type of stuff to implement EMV. It's a very useful forum. I personally have gotten loads of information from that particular organization. Card brands also support us. You know, Linda mentioned the liability shift deferment. That was in deference to the complexity of the petro outdoor market. Something I should mention that Conexxus had a very strong or very important role in explaining that to the brand so they understood where we came from and did get that deferment. I don't have any crystal balls, but don't count on another one of those, just saying. So one of the other things the brands did is shortly after EMV processing came out, they introduced a process called QuickChip. That reduced certification times, reduced the complexity of implementing EMV. So that was a help. That was a result of feedback from what they observed happening in the industry, and they reacted and helped to make things better. So card brands certainly take part in that. And then lastly, your vendors. You know, whoever you're working with, they are likely working with one or more of these particular industry organizations to solve problems and provide you the best possible software in the shortest amount of time that we can. So I mentioned I was going to talk about certifications, and I kind of want to focus on that. So EMV, one of the unique things about EMV is that every EMV implementation requires a certification, what we call an end-to-end certification, from the terminal to the issuer or brand be done. So that can take a lot of time to accomplish. That's in addition to L1 certifications that are required that make sure that the terminal can read the chip properly, can do any other low-level EMV hardware type communications, you know, make sure that the leads are in the right place so that they contact that little chip you see on the card in the proper locations, that kind of stuff. That's an L1. And L2 is the kernel certification. The kernel is a software program that runs on all of these EMV devices that uses the L1 hardware to communicate to the card, and it's a series of or implements a series of commands that actually perform the EMV transaction. There are separate certifications for those, and then that L3 certification is what I opened with. That's what the payment application has to get in order to process cards through an EMV terminal. We have to do these certifications not only when we first put out a release, but other times too. All of those certifications expire. The L1, L2, L3, they expire. So as they expire, actually L3 I don't think expires, the L1 and L2 expire. So we have to get new certifications when those L1 and L2 certs expire. If you make changes in the payment application, you do have to repeat L3 certifications. And that happens not a whole lot, but if you are adding functionality like contactless, you're certainly going to have to recertify your payment software. So you have to do lots of certifications there. I think I covered most of these things already. The certifications are required for every EMV kernel that you have. It's required for every acquirer that we talk to, and I have a diagram illustrating that coming up here. Reducing this certification time has been a priority in the organizations that I mentioned before, but these past efforts have focused on reducing test cases. And while that helped, it wasn't a paradigm shift in the way we worked. What we needed was a paradigm shift. So why focus on the certifications? It's because we do a whole lot of them. If you look in the little black star down at the bottom right, you see that, and this is a Verifone illustration. The EMV devices and kernels we have and the acquirers that we have, when we put out a release of software, we are responsible for doing about 100 end-to-end certifications. These certifications, if things go well, take about 3 weeks. You might, you know, after you've done 80 or so of them, maybe you could get it down to 2 weeks. But do the math in your head. You know, 100 certifications times 2 or 3 weeks, how long it takes to do these certifications. So clearly something has to be done. And the way this works is, if you look at the EMV devices along the side, the left side, each one of those EMV devices has to be individually certified along each one of those blue arrows to each of the acquirers that we support. So we do EMV device 1 to acquire 1, EMV device 2 to acquire 1, all the way down the list. Then we do EMV device 1 to acquirer 2, EMV device 2 to acquirer 2, all the way down the list. That's why so many of those appear. So the idea is, why not provide an industry solution, leverage an architecture that's common in Petro, where we have a generally refer to an EPS, an electronic payment server. That is where the payment application resides. All the logic for processing cards resides in that EPS. We use that EMV data terminal as a data source only. There's no payment logic in that terminal. So why does it matter what terminal we read that data from? As long as the data is just going to the EPS makes all the payment decisions and goes out to the acquiring host. So this solution leverages that in the fact that the EPS doesn't change as we change the terminals. So we came up with a solution that was a result of a lot of industry work, mostly through the US Payment Forum. Conexxus participated, a number of vendors participated, a number of acquirers participated, all the brands participated, and the result of that was a white paper that is available, and I have the link there, that describes this new simplified certification solution. And this is what it looks like in pictures. So if you remember the previous one, down the left-hand side was the line of all the EMV devices, and then we had to take each one of those devices to each one of our acquirers. What this new strategy says is just take one of those EMV devices and certify it end-to-end through one acquirer and call that a baseline. Then you can take all of the other EMV devices that you use running through that same payment application and self-certify those as a vendor. And the reason we're able to do that is because all those messages in green that you see circled there, those are the exact same messages for every EMV device. And they are the exact same message for every EMV device because Conexxus defines a standard in that space, and the vendors can follow that standard. And if they do follow that standard, this can apply to them very easily. So the end result of that, as you see in that black box, black star at the top, results in us having to do 7 certifications instead of 100 certifications end to end. Now that doesn't mean we're going to not do the self-certifications that you see here. In fact, my contention all along has been that not only will we do those self-certifications will be much more robust than the end-to-end certifications that we had done in the past. If you remember back a couple slides ago, I said, previous certification streamline efforts have resulted in a reduction of test cases. That's very true, and we're to the point now where the test cases are bare minimum. In fact, sometimes I think they don't really cover enough. If we can do this self-certification just once instead of repeating it 100 times, we can make that test much more robust. We don't have to reduce the test cases anymore. So I think it's a win-win for everybody here, and it is officially accepted by all the card brands. A number of acquirers have expressed support for it, and a number of vendors have expressed support for it. So this is something that's ongoing and is going to have a big impact on our ability to release software versions containing indoor and outdoor EMV, contactless EMV, all the different combinations of things we have. This is going to have a big impact on that, and a big impact in a good way. So just wanted to cover out all that. And with that, I know I went through here really quick. I just wanted to wrap up by summing up what moving to EMV is about. So the liability shift is coming on us 300 days away, October 2020. If you are not EMV capable at that time, you could be liable for counterfeit, and in some cases lost and stolen, depends on the brand, fraud. Fraud is going to migrate to the non-EMV enabled sites. These guys that are committing the fraud are not stupid. They also don't want to get caught. They don't want to work hard. They want to do the easiest thing that they can, most bang for the buck. They're going to take their efforts to non-EMV enabled sites. Robert mentioned chargebacks are wasted money. If you don't upgrade to EMV and you get hit with these chargebacks, you're going to have to pay that bill, and then eventually you're probably going to upgrade to EMV anyway. So that's just money you're throwing away while you're not upgrading to EMV. hardware and technician availability certainly favor early adopters. You know, I think almost without exception, the hardware is currently available now. The software is becoming available. If you're able, you know, get hardware ready for EMV. It certainly will take a load off the, or remove an obstacle towards getting a technician when you're ready to implement the software. Take advantage of the industry resources. Conexxus is a great resource. Linda's got a link to some other resources, I think, at the end of this that she'll talk about. That U.S. Payment Forum page has a great number of resources, and work with your vendors. You know, if you got questions, ask us. We'd much rather address your questions up front instead of, you know, assume something and have it be a problem later. So certainly work with your vendors. And with that, I am going to turn it back over to Linda, and she can close.
Great, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Robert. So I did want to give you guys some information on resources. So as Brian mentioned, our website, conexxus.org. If you click on resources and then EMV resources, there's a couple things out there. First off, there's a countdown clock. That's why I know it's 300 days away. There's also a resource guide, which one of our committees put together. This is a great white paper that pulls together a bunch of third-party or not necessarily Conexxus white papers, webinars, you know, you name it, it's in there. And it's grouped by topic. So this is a great place to start if you have specific questions about, you know, what is Quick Chip or how does this affect my loyalty? This is a great place to go to find very specific information. I encourage you to flip through that. It's free. Everything on the Conexxus website that I'm mentioning is free. Also, if you participated in the survey, thank you very much. If you're interested in the results, the full survey results are out there on our website, same location. We are also working on a risk tool that, and it should be up either later this month or the first week in January or so. We're working hard to get that finished and up on the website. It will allow you to put in your site-specific information and calculate, you know, based on some of your numbers, how much fuel you're doing, et cetera, based on, you know, your particulars, what that's going to look like. So look out for that. Again, we have a lot of webinars out there. Any number of them are on EMV. You can also view the EMV presentation we did at NACS. As Brian mentioned, the Secure Technology Alliance and U.S. Payments Forum have gotten together to put out a site, EMV Connections. That link is there. All kinds of good stuff out there. A lot of what's out there is also mentioned in the Conexxus resource guide. Finally, Visa. Robert mentioned their best practices paper. That's the link to that. And just as a reminder, if you fill out the survey once the webinar finishes a couple hours from now, you'll get a survey in your email. If you fill that out, you'll get a link to download this deck. So all of this will be available. And then the recording will be made available a couple weeks from now on our website. So with that, I want to go ahead and get to Q&A. Brian, if you'll just advance that slide for me. We've gotten quite a bit of questions already. If you still have questions that you haven't typed in, go ahead and do that. We'll try to get through as many of these as we can without holding you guys over. So first up, somebody asked about the liability shift for Voyager and WEX and whether or not the same rules were going to apply. I know at least for WEX, the intent is to have the liability shift in line with the majors. However, to get those specifics, I would encourage you to reach out to whatever fleet card provider you accept and are using. So reach directly out to Voyager and WEX to get your specifics. Robert, this one is a good one for you. Well, I guess a couple of different things. So which party is liable if the merchant has EMV at the pump? You went over this, but the question came back.
Sure. So if the merchant has a pump that's enabled for EMV for counterfeit fraud after 2020, the issuer would be liable for counterfeit fraud, whether the transaction was chip read or was mag stripe read. However, if the transaction was mag stripe read, even though the pump was chip enabled, lost stolen fraud liability would still remain with the merchant. If it was a chip on chip transaction, then the issuer would then have liability for lost stolen fraud.
Okay, great. Robert, this is a question for you. So a lot of your graphs that showed the fraud, they did not have a scale on the vertical column. I assume that was by on purpose, just to show the trends, but somebody asked what that scale was. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so we're not by corporate policy allowed to publicly disclose system numbers or numbers out of our system. So really, it's just what I showed there was really just to show the trend and rates, so that we're trying to keep it easy to follow as far as comparing apples to apples as far as rates go. So comparing fraud to sales. But we're only allowed to publicly disclose the trends, not get into specific numbers.
Great. This question asked why Florida, Texas, and California are so much higher and more attractive for the fraudsters.
Yeah, I think a lot of it just has to do with how the gangs operate. If you really look at the way fraud goes, it kind of just follows the, especially it's along those states, but then it kind of goes up the East Coast and a little bit up the west. But in Florida, we if I can just talk about that for a second, we actually worked with the authorities in Tallahassee to make sure that they were aware that they were the #1 state for fraud at the pumps, and spent a fair amount of time working with the Attorney General and folks there, because our concern was we weren't sure at the time if they had some laws that were more conducive to allowing this fraud, or if there was an issue with enforcement. It turned out when we did the investigation, the laws were as good as any of the other states. It really, we were working then to help them from an enforcement standpoint. But honestly, there's just certain gangs that tend to work in those areas. In Florida, if you really look at it, it tends to be a mess pretty much throughout the state, especially around the big cities. Texas, it's more kind of in Houston, down near the border. In California, it's mostly in Southern California.
Okay, great. Let's see here. So Robert, maybe you could take this one. Is there going to be a chip and pin requirement coming?
No, there's no plans to do that. And really, when you look again at the fraud trends, chip is authenticating the card to mitigate counterfeit fraud. PIN is there to authenticate the card holder to mitigate lost stolen. And one, you're not just seeing any increase in lost stolen fraud. And then, as I mentioned, if the merchant with the Visa rules, if the merchant does not support a fallback at the pump and sends all those fallbacks inside, they don't have any lost stolen fraud liability. So there would really be no reason for them to have to do PIN for those transactions to avoid that liability.
Okay. This question asks, are there details available that show the total dollars in EMV fraud that has occurred at dispensers this year that have not been charged to merchants? So I think, from an industry point of view, I think that's what we showed. That's the collective estimated in 2020 to be 451 million. So that's today what we're seeing at the pump in terms of counterfeit fraud that isn't being passed along to the merchants, but that come the liability shift, that will be passed along to the merchants. So that's from an industry point of view. And then Robert, can you tell people how to get their particular numbers, if they want to know what's happening at their site?
I'm glad you brought that up, Linda. So, if a merchant's seeing any fraud chargebacks today, it's for lost stolen fraud. And really, that is the tip of the iceberg if you kind of follow what we've been saying here in terms of comparing counterfeit fraud to lost stolen fraud at the pump. So a lot of merchants may not know really kind of that part of the iceberg that's underwater, which is counterfeit fraud that they could be facing come October. So what you can do is reach out to your acquiring processors. They should be able to get that information. What we've been doing has been actually I've been doing is providing them, at least from a visa perspective, fraud, both lost, stolen, and counterfeit by location. They should be able to have that. And so if you kind of work with them, they can reach out to us in order to get anything that they may not have. But my recommendation, strong recommendation, would be that you work with your acquiring processor as a merchant to kind of understand what your numbers are. But then also, if if your numbers are not really that great right now, I wouldn't say it's a reason to kind of just forget about this and kind of move on, because as I was saying, these guys are really quick at and adapt at moving to the next place that's less secure. And in fact, what we saw was the fraud really took off at the pumps pretty much after the the point of sale, the 2015 date was in place for a few months. So about 9 months after that liability shift is when we saw the fraud move to the pumps. And so what's going to end up happening is if you don't implement because you don't think your numbers are there, you'll be surprised how quickly they'll move, because of course a lot of your competitors will become enabled, and it's just going to force more concentration on those sites that aren't.
Okay. We are just about out of time, but I do want to ask this one. So is the liability shift date going to move? And I would encourage everybody to look at the NACS Daily article that came out yesterday that the MAG had announced. The MAG is the Merchant Advisory Group, and they had requested from the card brands a further delay in the liability shift, and they received information that that would not happen. So for any of you out there that are hoping for a delay or, hearing rumors that that's going to happen, it won't. And again, please read the article that came out on the NACS Daily yesterday, and it's also publicly available on the MAG website. Robert, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I just want to say, if you look at some of the data points here, the fraud is just continuing to increase, and the issuers are absorbing that. And they've really done everything they can by putting chips on their cards. And you can, again, look at the numbers that almost every card out there has a chip on it now. So, from their standpoint, it's kind of like there's nothing more they can do. And they're basically saying, we've got this technology that needs to be able to be used. And yeah, there's no appetite to extend the date. Really, when you look at it, we announced these dates back in back in 2011. We announced the original AFD date in 2017 for U.S. domestic, and then pushed that out another 3 years. And we're at the end of the line now.
Okay. With that, guys, it is just a few minutes after the top of the hour, and I want to be respectful of your time. For the questions that we didn't get to, a lot of these are very specific in terms of implementation and hardware. I'm going to pass these along to the group that's doing part 2 next week to make sure that they answer these questions. But again, if something didn't get answered and you want to follow up with us, you can email us at info@conexxus.org, and also Robert and Brian's email information is on I think the presenter slide. So when you get that deck, you'll have their information as well. So thank you everyone for attending. I really encourage you to register for part 2 of this next week if you haven't already. And thank you for attending.